I want to start my story in reverse as far as the images are concerned. The guys from Matrix are here. Matrix Software, I think, is the new branding of their yield tracking system, and they are here in Lagos implementing the system in the factory that I've designed. And I took them to Hard Rock Cafe on the island today, and these are the images as we arrived there. And then I'm going to share some images as we drove to the site while I'm talking to you guys about salt. So the thing about salt is that it's one of those cultural elements that somehow these things gets lost in the maze of the details of our culture. It's like fire. There's a couple of things like salt, and before I get to my main point is going to be that in the Hallstatt Celtic culture that I've been alerted to by Christine Berger, I think is how you would say it in the Austrian or German language, Berger in English, is she wrote me a mail about the link that I saw between the Salzburg salt mines in Austria and the Turpan area in the western regions of China. Asia Hither, as it was called in antiquity by old writers, and who said that meat curing probably originated from that area. In any case, that is a different story altogether. I'll get to that at the end. But I always knew that salt, let me say it like this, I knew that the central regions of Europe would played a pivotal role in establishing the meat curing tradition. But then, one of the things that I've learned about our culture is that when human culture started to evolve, we started from a blank, from nothing. And every step, every element, everything that we perceive to be natural and that it has been like this from eternity past, is wrong. All these things had a start, like the use of fire, for example. Fire was discovered multiple times by multiple civilizations, and it took a couple of years from cave dwellings. It is evident that fire was discovered, and then the practice of making fire was lost for a long periods of time before the people who occupied the cave would start making fires again. And you can see that from the sediments, from the layers inside the cave. It's easy for archaeologists to pinpoint that. And things like fire, which we thought has been part of human existence from eternity, it is not. It became part of our culture through very specific innovations and practices. Another thing is, for example, the slaughtering of animals. Slaughtering of animals underwent several developments. For example, the letting out of the blood, the cutting of the neck to let out the blood, that's a specific innovation, an adaptation, so something that we started to do that became part of our culture. It is not natural. Somebody decided in antiquity that this is a better way of doing it. And not only decided that, but they had the cultural reach in terms of influence to spread this information around the globe so that it became a universal practice. But it was not like that from the beginning of time. A similar thing is salt, which is the subject of my musings tonight. Salt has not been part of the human culture from antiquity. Salt is not natural to the human existence. I did a lot of work on this. to understand the physiology of salt in the human body. Yes, we need salt. And every textbook out there will start to say that humans need salt for the preservation of meat and because for health reasons, if we cannot live without salt. But universally that was not applied. Universally, cultures did not use salt to preserve their meat, and they definitely did not consume salt for health reasons. In fact, there's evidence from, I've got an article that I will link to this. The first article I wrote on the conclusions that I came to about where does the obsession about salt curing of meat and salt preservation of meat come from, which we find in the European nations. This is particular to Europe and maybe China. And maybe North America. I've heard stories about the native Indians who lived there who used salt, and I haven't spent time to validate that, whether that was actually the fact or not. I did spend some time on China to see in China and in Taiwan there were well-developed salt works, but this was not the case around the globe. For example, in Africa, Dr. Zander, who's a professor in archaeology at the Pretoria University, many years ago when I started down this journey about salt, told me that salt is not used in Africa or Southern Africa. It was not used as a condiment or to preserve meat. And it took me years to validate what he said. And it is absolutely true. It was not used as a condiment. Not among the Khoi people or the San Bushmen or the native African, the Nguni tribes, the Xhosas and the Zulus who came down the east coast of South Africa, migrated into Southern Africa from Central and West Africa. It was definitely not a part and parcel of their culture. In fact, even here in West Africa, despite the fact that many of the kingdoms in West Africa were founded upon salt mining industries, to this day, one of the things that astounds me is the fact that the Nigerian culture is very sensitive to salt. They do not like a lot of salt. They do not like a lot of spices. They want to taste the meat. One of the first critiques that I got on the sausages that I made in Nigeria is that it is too salty. They don't want to taste so much salt. And then a collaborator that I have, a research collaborator, inquired at ancient or with very old residents of rural communities, and they say that salt was not part of their diet on a regular basis. They would use ash. In Southern Africa, I also found the use of ash. And for a long time I thought, that is where salt came in. But it was not. It was not. Salt in New Zealand, among the Maori people, there's no evidence of salt production. There's evidence of them knowing about salt, detailed understanding of the dangers of salt. If they would forest certain animals from the sea, they would, for example, soak them in salt water, in fresh water for a long time to make sure that they get rid of the saltiness. Otherwise, they will not be able to consume large quantities of those sea animals, and they will get sick from it. They knew the dangers in salt. And so the European nations became known as people who cure their meats with salt. And there's this Eurocentric view from a lot of researchers, a lot of people. They start their books by saying salt was used to preserve meat, and people knew that they had to consume a little bit of salt. And then they go on this whole story about how in Africa people sweat a lot and they would be depleted from salt, and for health reasons they would consume a lot of salt. What a bunch of rubbish. It is not validated by the facts of history. People got ample salt from the meat that they ate. There's lots of evidence from that. They did not have to supplement their salt intake, which they got from meat. Humans do not have a physiological innate desire to eat salt or to crave salt when we are deficient in salt, like animals. Physiologically, this is a fact. So So those notions are completely wrong. We have in Africa then a very good example, Nepal. I had a similar experience in Nepal where when Manette and Tristan and myself climbed up to Fishtail Mountain, we interrogated this issue of salt in use in dry meat, in drying practices of meat. And they said that they do not use salt. And I was amazed by that. No salt. So I have lots of evidence of the Maori people, the Nepalese people, the people from Southern Africa, the people from Nigeria. No use of salt. And Nigeria had access to West Africa, part of West Africa, access to so much salt. So what did the people use the salt for? Well, they used it for their cattle. It's a huge reason why people used a lot of salt in West Africa is for cattle, for the animals. Right? So the European view of salt, to import that into the textbooks, as I see that, books that people write, scholars, renowned scholars, is just completely wrong. And I realized that somebody had to decide that we're going to use salt to cure meat, to preserve meat. And there's lots of examples. The people who study history in the greatest detail go through every one of the most ancient sites of salt production that is found in Europe. And they chronicle that, but it is up to the Iron Age. It's not that many sites where salt was being produced. And then the Iron Age came, and this is where, so my work focused on the Turpan area, and I'll do something separate about this, where I think that meat curing with nitrites, so the use of nitrite salts, saltpeter, which is nitrate, NO3, the ionic form, where did that come from? Somewhere, so sure, Professor Millet tells me that through the deamination of the proteins when the meat was stored in water or is stored in water, yes, the surface proteins undergo deamination and curing can take place. Yes, there's many places where accidentally curing can be observed. But it is not just a matter of observing the curing, it is which civilization, which people had the wherewithal and the reach to be able to not just identify that curing is taking place, but to change this, to fortify this in a cultural practice, in culture, in a procedure, in this is how you're going to cure meat, step A, B, C, D, E. And I've done lots of work on that. It's all available in Earthworm Express. The dry curing of meat. The English master curer, Roberts, given me great understanding of the greatest current or the greatest recipes handed down to us from antiquity on how to cure meat with salt only. Those things exist. It's well known to everybody. But which culture had the reach to make this a universal, a global practice? It is not just an isolated group of people living in a little hill country in France who decide they know how to cure meat and they now change the world. No, you had to have the cultural reach, you had to have the trade route, you had to have the ability to influence people. And so I've been, the example of Turpan is a great example because in Turpan I looked for other evidence of the use of saltpeter apart from the curing of meat, because there's no evidence of the curing of meat. But the Turpan is a unique area because sal ammoniac, ammonium nitrate, ammonium nitrate is found in abundance in the mountains surrounding the Turpan Depression, and then saltpeter is found on the top level of the soil, not further down as is the case, further layers down as is the case in the Atacama Desert. That's why I discounted that Atacama as the place where curing could have been changed into a procedure, into a practice, to be culturally appropriated by humans with the ability to spread that across the globe. Also, the Atacama Desert in Chile and Peru is too isolated. The reach was never into Europe. But Turpan is different. It's in the western regions of China at the moment, currently. It wasn't China, of course, back then. And it was on the Silk Road. So, wow, here we tick a couple of boxes. Trade routes, ability to spread, influential. And then I discovered that there's other uses, medicine uses in the area, the use of saltpeter, which shows a profound understanding of this substance, of the salt. And from there I developed the idea and said, well, this is maybe an area to really look at very carefully. And then I had this email from Austria. And Christine Berger sent me a mail and said to me, you may be onto something there, but have you honestly considered what is the importance of the Hallstatt salt mines close to Salzburg? And then I learned about this massive culture that existed there, the Celtic culture in the Hallstatt region. In Hallstatt, not just the region, in the Hallstatt. And that they discovered curing balls there that could contain, this is in the 500s, 300 to 500s, they built these massive curing balls where they could cure pork with salt from these salt mines that they had. And not just that, but the region did not itself have the ability to sustain the large enough pork population to feed these curing works. There was a whole industry that developed where pork were brought from far afield to feed this industry, and people gained the understanding of salt. Well, the Celts from this civilization also developed iron smelting. This is early Iron Age now. And their culture is there's markers to their culture in terms of how they bury their people. Very elaborate burial sites and beautiful examples of their ironwork. And you can trace when and how this culture spread into France and across Europe, even eventually into England. And I thought, my goodness, here we have a civilization that is this important and pivotal. It had the ability to not just fortify the process of curing pork, of preserving meat with salt, but they had the ability to spread this information across Europe in a fundamental way. And with ironworks went the curing of pork and curing of meat with salt, the use of salt. And what I've learned from Africa is that it is by no means a given that you preserve meat by salt. In Africa, in West Africa, it is done through the use of dietary fibers. After the coconut is, the oil is extracted from the palm oil. The palm oil is extracted. And what you are left with is the cake, and that is applied to the meat, which is then dried, and the product in Nigeria, we call it kilishi, is created. And another thing that they did, they used the oil that from the extraction process. They would boil the meat first and then deep fry it. Little use of salt. What had happened to the curing of meat? There was no tradition of curing of meat in Africa. I looked for it for years. It's not here. Africa dealt with it in a different way. Africa solved the issue of microorganism or food safety in completely a different way from the Western world. And it is not predicated on the use of salt. That is the clear fact of history. So now when we go back to Europe and we interpret the events of this culture from Hallstatt, we realize that this is something unique that is happening here. This is a civilization that is appropriating a practice culturally that was the case in many different locations across Europe. Over many years, they figured this out. But then what they did at Hallstatt is that they appropriated this and they industrialized this. 500, 300 years before the Christian era, before Christ. My goodness. How absolutely amazing this is. How far removed are they from the Industrial Revolution? And they did it on that scale. And so as the culture spread, this practice spread, they had the means, they had the motivation. Why? Because does it not beautifully fit in? They want to sell their salt. The culture now becomes predicated upon the sale of not just the iron and iron smelting and the technology, but also the sale of the salt. They achieve control over the salt mines in Germany, in the rest of southern Germany, in France, and in England, and in the Turpan region. In Western China, and there's evidence which I will make the subject of the next discussion, which is absolutely fascinating. The same clothing that was found in the salt mines in Salzburg, operated by this culture, is found in Turpan. The western regions of China, Caucasians living there, not Chinese people, Caucasians. From where? It's a whole discussion. Leads me into the Balkan regions, into the regions surrounding the Black Sea. Historically, how that. So what you have is you have this interplay, because on the one hand you have the culture who's using salt and they have these discoveries, but then it becomes they're teaching this and teaching the techniques of salting meat feeds into their own cultural prosperity, into the prosperity of the system, because it now what is the word? It stimulates the trade in salt even more. I'm very eager in West Africa to delve into the issue of the existence of salt kingdoms in this region, where they would trade gold for salt. And salt for gold, and trade the gold into Europe. And the primary reason was this, because they wanted to give salt to every person and preserve meat. I don't think it was the case. I think it fed directly into the cattle industry. And that's part of my research here in West Africa at the moment. I've got Theodore, a great, beloved fellow researcher working with me on this project. And Theodore, I'm presenting this to you as well, in a sense, to stimulate you and to motivate you and to give you an idea where to look for and what to look for. Things are not the way they seem. There's a lot of westernization that happened in West Africa. We need to peel back the layers of history to a time before westernization happened. And this image of the salt culture from Europe came into West Africa, in Southern Africa, in the 1300s and 1400s. The indigenous people would refer to the Europeans as people who eat salted meat, because they themselves did not. And then they will explain how people would get sick if they eat too much of this meat, because it's so foreign to their bodies. So the thesis is that the Celtic Hallstatt culture became the evangelist, if you will, the method, the mechanism, better word, that facilitated the spread of this practice of using salt in meat into Italy. The Romans adopted it, into France, into Portugal, into Hungary, into England. Right? And so there's this commonality among the European nations in how to cure bacon and how to make hams. They call it by different names, of course. Prosciutto. All kinds of beautiful names. But it's the same thing. It is the use of salt to preserve meat. And salt then, there's a whole lot of chemical reactions that flows from that. But at the heart of it is the use of salt. Sodium chloride. It did not happen by accident, nor was it a natural thing for humans to end up with salt. It is not like animals, where animals migrate to the salt pans and go and lick it when they experience a deficiency of salt. Physiologically, humans are not put together like this. We are not put together like this. And as the agricultural revolution took hold, and more people started to develop agriculture, and it spread across the globe of 8,000, 9,000 years ago. The people who the plants that was not rich in salt created some kind of a deficiency in humans, and people became sick of it. I wrote about this recently in an article when I discussed this issue of the physiology of salt in humans. We do not naturally crave salt. We funny enough crave, for example, milk, or we crave meat, which will give us the salt, but we don't necessarily crave the salt. Animals seems to naturally crave the salt. And I think we learned this, the importance of salt in our diet, by following animals and see that they go and lick the salt, and then using that salt and tasting it and experiencing it. But humans do not need salt. All we need to do is eat meat, which we have been designed to do. If I say design, it's of course we evolved to do that as scavengers at the birth of human race. And the Cultural Revolution changed things a little bit, but there's certain plants, palms for example, rich in salt, and so the ash of the plant, of the palm, would provide a lot of salt. So rolling the dried meat in that ash, as they did in southern Africa, would have an effect of picking up some salt, even though the primary reason why they did that was not for taste reasons, but it was to prevent the flies from sitting on the meat, is to keep the flies under control. But the biggest revelation to me has been this: the fact that salt is not by any stretch of the imagination something natural to the human. And why the same thing happened in China, but that's a different story. We will get to that one day. And the same thing happened in Polynesia and in Taiwan, and we'll get to that. There's a very interesting stories, but it's a similar story. There was a culture who had the ability to produce the salt, and in whose interest it was to sell a lot of the salt. And so it was by design that salt became so important in human affairs.